Are your energy bills making you sweat, even in winter? Trust me, I've been there. Last year I stared at my heating bill so long, I half expected the numbers to magically shrink. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But here's something wild. Our ancestors from the Middle Ages might have actually had the ultimate life hacks for staying warm without spending a single penny on electricity. And no, they weren't just sitting around shivering in the dark. Medieval folks were absolute pros at heating their homes efficiently, using tricks that have pretty much vanished, kind of like your dad's hairline in his 40s. When the Industrial Revolution rolled in with its fancy new heating systems, people ditched these old-school methods faster than leftovers from last week. But get this, recent archaeological findings suggest that some medieval homes maintain temperatures as high as 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of winter, using nothing but these forgotten techniques. That's impressive, especially for people who also thought the Earth was flat. One of their most genius inventions. The medieval hearth. This wasn't just some tiny fireplace tucked away in a corner like a shy teenager at a school dance. No, the hearth was the beating heart of the home, standing proudly in the centre of the main room, working with the entire house to create a natural heating system. Here's why it was brilliant. The stones around and underneath the hearth absorbed heat during the day, acting like a giant rechargeable heating pad. Even after the fire burned out, these stones continued radiating warmth for up to 12 hours, basically the medieval version of a heated blanket. And the smoke? That was part of the plan too. Instead of whooshing up a chimney, which many homes didn't even have, the smoke lingered under the roof, helping to repel pests and naturally preserve food hanging from the rafters. Talk about an all-in-one home heating, pest control, and food storage system. Recent studies of surviving medieval homes even show that these central hearths could effectively heat spaces up to 600 square feet without a single watt of electricity. Pretty incredible, right? And this is just the beginning. Imagine this. Archaeologists have found medieval stone floors scorched from being repeatedly heated to over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than my oven on pizza night. Suddenly, my sad attempt at reheating leftovers feels embarrassingly weak. But what about those extra cold nights when even the mighty hearth wasn't enough? That's when medieval folks got really creative, with community heating solutions. And here's where it gets fascinating. While we might barely nod at our neighbours today, medieval people actually needed theirs, especially during winter. That old saying, "It takes a village," wasn't just a feel-good phrase, it was their actual survival strategy. Every village had communal fire spots, and honestly, they sound way better than any awkward HOA meeting. These massive, always burning fires were usually set up in the village square or a dedicated building called a warming house. But don't think of them as just some big bonfire. These spots were the medieval equivalent of coffee shops, town halls, and social media all rolled into one. People would bring their work, share news, aka medieval Facebook, cook together, and just hang out. Historians even found records showing that some villages kept these fires going 24/7 throughout the winter, with families taking turns to feed the flames. And get this, these medieval engineers knew what they were doing. Warming houses were strategically built so that smoke blew away from the main village areas, because who wants a whole town smelling like a smokehouse? Studies even show that a single warming house could heat up to 50 people at once, way more efficient than every home struggling with its own fire. Talk about medieval energy conservation. But the best part? The sense of community. People shared stories, arranged marriages, and even held court sessions around these fires. One historian even found a record from 1267 where villagers settled a property dispute over a chicken, all while warming their toes by the fire. Now that's what I call multitasking. Of course, sometimes you just couldn't make it to the communal fire, or maybe you just weren't in the mood to hear Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down brag about her prize-winning turnips again. That's when medieval personal heating hacks came into play. Instead of modern hand warmers, these folks invented portable heat before portable anything was even a thing. They carried heated pocket stones, tiny, reusable heat sources that worked like a medieval version of a mini furnace you could take anywhere. And trust me, we're only scratching the surface of their winter survival genius. Up next, even crazier medieval hacks that kept people warm without electricity. Imagine carrying a tiny, portable fireplace in your pocket. Sounds pretty genius, right? Well, that's exactly what medieval folks did. Instead of shivering in the cold, they walked around with their own personal heaters, because staying warm back then wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. One of the most popular gadgets was called a chauffe-fête. Fancy French name, but it was basically a metal ball with holes in it, filled with hot coals. You'd slip it into your pocket or tuck it inside a muff and boom, instant heat. The rich had luxurious ones made of silver or gold, while everyday folks used iron or copper. And this wasn't some rare, niche item. A merchant's inventory from 1378 listed over 30 different types of hand warmers. Talk about medieval product variety. But the real game changer? Pocket stones. These were smooth river stones heated by the fire until they were toasty warm, then wrapped in cloth and carried around. Archaeologists have found thousands of them with telltale signs of wear, some even with grooves worn into them from being carried in the same pocket day after day. Makes my phone's wear marks look pretty boring in comparison. And here's where it gets really clever. These heated stones weren't just for hands. People slipped them into boots, tucked them inside clothing, and even used them to warm up beds before sleeping. There's even a court record from 1422 where a man got in trouble for stealing someone else's heated stone during a church service. The punishment? He had to provide heated stones for the entire congregation for the rest of winter. Imagine being sentenced to be everyone's personal heating service. But medieval people didn't stop there. Some doctors even prescribed specific stones for different ailments. Got a stomachache? Try a flat stone. Sore back? Use a curved one. It was like a medieval heating pad prescription. And funny enough, modern science actually proves they were onto something. Heat therapy really does help with pain relief. Now, when personal heating wasn't enough, medieval folks turned to an even more surprising heat source. And no, I'm not talking about cats and dogs. Their ultimate home heating solution? Livestock. Ever wondered why medieval barns were often connected to houses? It wasn't because farmers were too lazy to walk outside. They were using their animals as living, breathing furnaces. A single cow gives off as much heat as a small space heater, around 1,000 BTUs per hour. Now imagine 5 or 6 cows plus a few sheep. That's a serious heating system. Medieval farmers designed their homes to share a wall with their barns, usually on the north side, blocking the harsh winter winds while letting the animals' body heat seep through the walls. Basically, it was like having a bunch of space heaters that also gave you milk and wool. Studies of surviving medieval farmhouses even show that rooms sharing walls with livestock pens were noticeably warmer than other parts of the house. And believe it or not, we're still not done with medieval heating tricks. Up next, even crazier ways people stayed warm without electricity. Did you know that medieval farmers had built-in heating systems that required zero electricity? Their secret? Livestock-powered warmth. Rooms that shared walls with barns stayed about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the rest of the house. And the best part? These living space heaters were self-maintaining. Just feed them some hay, and they'd keep pumping out warmth all night long. Sure, the smell wasn't exactly refreshing. Medieval Febreze wasn't a thing. But when the alternative was freezing solid, a little barnyard aroma didn't seem so bad. In fact, a medieval text from 1382 gives specific instructions on which animals made the best heaters. Cows were the MPVS, followed by horses. Chickens? Well, they were basically the medieval version of those tiny USB hand warmers that barely do anything. And get this, a landlord in 1415 actually charged lower rent for houses that didn't share a wall with the barn. That's right. Medieval real estate came with built-in heating discounts. But what if you couldn't handle the scent of odor barnyard? No problem. Medieval folks had another trick up their woolen sleeves. They figured out how to make firework twice as hard using reflectors. Now here's where it gets wild. Long before anyone understood the science of heat radiation, these folks were using shiny metal plates and polished stone surfaces to bounce heat back into a room. It's like they discovered thermal physics centuries before textbooks did. The most common heat reflectors were made of polished brass or copper sheets, placed strategically around fireplaces and cooking areas. And we're not talking about tiny decorative panels. Some of these metal plates were as big as dining tables. By the 14th century, wealthier homes took it even further, installing entire walls covered in polished metal panels. Imagine walking into a medieval mansion and seeing a wall of gleaming brass reflecting firelight and warming up the room. Talk about medieval bling with a purpose. And here's the crazy part. Modern experiments on recreated medieval reflectors show that they could increase a room's temperature by up to 30%. That means more heat, less firewood, and a cozier winter. My high school physics teacher would have been seriously impressed. One French castle even had silver-plated walls in its great hall. The lord who installed them wasn't just flexing his wealth, he was creating a massive heat-reflecting system. Though I bet explaining that to the tax collector was interesting. No, really, these solid silver walls are for heating, not just to make my neighbours jealous. And medieval engineers didn't stop there. They discovered that curved reflectors worked even better than flat ones. Some homes even had corner fireplaces with curved metal backs, which helped spread heat evenly across an entire room. It's like they invented medieval surround sound, but for heat. And believe it or not, we're still not done with their genius heating hacks. Up next, even more surprising ways medieval people stayed warm, without burning through their wallets or firewood. Believe it or not, some medieval folks actually complained about their rooms being too hot. Imagine having that problem in the middle of winter. Take this monastery in 1388, for example. The monks there had a genius setup. They used angled metal reflectors to direct heat into their infirmary, creating targeted heating zones. They even called them God's mirrors. Though, let's be honest, God was probably more impressed with their prayers than their heating system. But what about those freezing winter nights when even the best reflectors couldn't keep the chill away? That's when medieval folks brought out their secret weapon for a cozy sleep, the bed warmer. Think of it as the medieval version of an electric blanket, just with more fire hazards. It was simple but brilliant. A long-handled copper or brass pan filled with hot coals that was slid between the sheets like a giant toasty sandwich filling. These warming pans weren't just practical. They were often beautifully decorated with intricate patterns, kind of like the fancy kitchen gadgets we love to show off today. Each pan could hold enough hot coals to keep a bed warm for 2 to 3 hours, usually long enough for someone to drift off into a cozy sleep. And while the wealthy had servants warming their beds for them, common folks had to shuffle the coals themselves. Fun fact, archaeologists found a warming pan from 1435 with the inscription, "Sweet dreams, don't let the ice bite." Seems like medieval people had a sense of humour about their freezing nights, but here's where it gets really interesting. They had a whole system worked out. The best coals were carefully selected from the evening fire, with the safest ones set aside specifically for bed warming. Why? Because no one wanted to wake up in a room full of smoke, or worse, on fire. In fact, some towns actually had official bed warmer inspectors. Yep, that was a real job, making sure people weren't using dangerous coals. Imagine putting that on your medieval LinkedIn profile. A single warming pan could raise a bed's temperature by 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, just enough to turn a freezing bed into a cozy nest. And during a particularly harsh winter in 1442, a nobleman reportedly used 6 different warming pans throughout the night to keep his massive bed heated. Now that's what I call high-maintenance sleeping. But not everyone could afford a fancy warming pan, or trust themselves not to set their beds on fire, so they turned to another clever solution, the canopy bed. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just about looking fancy. Canopy beds were actually brilliant heat traps. The heavy curtains wrapped around the bed acted like a personal sleeping bag, keeping body heat trapped inside and blocking out cold drafts. And here's the best part. These cozy enclosures didn't just keep people warm, They also helped heat up the room itself. The more people snuggled up in bed, the warmer the space stayed. It was basically medieval central heating, powered by body warmth. And guess what? We're still not done. Up next, more brilliant medieval heating tricks that just might make you rethink how you stay warm today. Canopy beds weren't just medieval interior design flexes, they were heat traps. Records show that these beds could keep the temperature inside up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the rest of the room. Basically, they were the original sleep pods, minus the Wi-Fi. Medieval carpenters became experts at designing these beds for maximum warmth. The best ones had double-layered curtains and a covered top, creating a mini-room within a room. Some were even built with special slots in the posts to hold those bed warmers we talked about earlier. Medieval smart home technology at its finest. And because humans love to compete over literally anything, people started showing off their fancy bed curtains. One 1389 record mentions a merchant who spent more on his bed curtains than his entire house. Now that's mixed up priorities, but hey, at least he was warm. Modern scientists tested a recreated medieval canopy bed and found that with all the curtains closed, it only took about 10 minutes for body heat to create a cosy microclimate inside. Talk about efficient insulation. But staying warm wasn't just about nighttime comfort. What about during the day? That's where medieval builders pulled off something genius. They harnessed the power of the sun. Without fancy solar panels or modern tech, these guys were basically solar energy pioneers. They figured out that by building houses with large windows facing south, they could trap the sun's heat like pros. And these weren't just random windows. They were placed strategically to catch the low winter sun while staying shady during summer. It's like they invented seasonal temperature control centuries before air conditioning. But the real magic? Stone walls. These thick walls acted like giant thermal batteries, soaking up heat during the day and slowly releasing it at night, kind of like a medieval version of a heated blanket. Tests on surviving medieval buildings showed that these walls could keep rooms warm for up to 8 hours after sunset. Some castles even had dedicated sunrooms with walls up to 6 feet thick. Now that's extreme insulation. And get this, archaeological studies found that some medieval houses were angled exactly 17.5 degrees east of true south. That's the perfect position for maximising winter sun exposure. And here I am, still struggling to figure out which way is north on my phone's compass. One particularly clever lord in 1356 built his great hall with different sized windows on each floor. The bottom ones were smaller to prevent heat loss, while the top ones were massive sun catchers. His servants probably thought he was nuts, but jokes on them, his heating bill was literally $0. But sometimes even the smartest sun-catching tricks weren't enough. So, medieval folks got even more creative. Up next, the wildest, most unexpected ways medieval people stayed warm. Trust me, you won't see these coming. When medieval builders needed to keep the cold out, they didn't just look around, they looked up. Those thatched roofs you see in medieval villages weren't just for rustic aesthetic vibes, they were actually amazing natural insulators. Packed straw creates thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat, working just like modern insulation. But unlike the itchy pink fiberglass we shove into our attics today, these roofs were 100% natural and could last for decades if properly maintained. A well-made thatched roof could be up to 2 feet thick, and tests show they were better at retaining heat than most modern roofing materials. And here's the wildest part. These roofs actually breathed. They let just enough moisture escape to prevent mould, while still keeping all the warm air trapped inside. A properly thatched roof could cut heat loss by 50% compared to other medieval roofing materials. One 1397 record mentions a brutal snowy winter where thatched roof houses stayed so warm that people had to open their windows in January. Meanwhile, their tile-roofed neighbours were probably huddled around their fires, wondering what kind of sorcery was happening next door. But if you think thatched roofs were impressive, wait until you hear about the ultimate medieval heating hack. It involved turning the floor into a giant heating pad. Here's the thing about really big stones. They hold on to heat like teenagers hold on to their phones. Medieval folks discovered that if you heated large stones in a fire and then tucked them under the floorboards, they'd radiate warmth for hours. Basically, medieval heated floors, before heated floors were even a thing. A typical setup used 20 to 30-pound stones that were heated up during the day and then slid into special slots under wooden floors or benches. Tests on similar stones show they could stay warm for up to 6 hours, which meant toasty floors all night long. Some medieval houses even had dedicated stone warming pits built right into their kitchens, kind of like a prehistoric microwave, but just for rocks. And in wealthier homes? Oh, they had heating schedules. One 15th century manor rotated 24 stones throughout the day, with servants switching them out every 4 hours. Now that's a hot job. Scientists estimate this system could keep room temperatures at around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, even when it was freezing outside. One monk wrote in 1403 about how they used this trick in their monastery's infirmary, calling it God's own heating. Though let's be real, if God was handling medieval architecture, he probably would have just invented central heating instead. And there you have it, 10 genius medieval heating hacks that honestly put some of our modern solutions to shame. Makes you wonder, what other brilliant ideas have we forgotten over the centuries? Maybe it's time to bring some of these back, minus the barnyard smells, of course.